This is the square root formula, and I want to go through what it means here for us. Now, notice what this means. It says if x squared is n, and this n is simply a number. That number can be positive, it could be negative, it could be 0. What I really am saying, though, is I have here a quadratic, and it's a special type of quadratic. It's one that just has the form x squared is equal to a number, x squared is n. I want to solve for x, and the formula we use here is that x will be plus or minus, there's two answers, plus or minus the square root of n. This is called the square root formula. The reason it's a square root formula is because you're going to have to take, obviously again, the square root of the number n. That's why they call it the square root formula. And this is what we're going to use here on this homework set. And that's it. So we're going to use the statement, if x squared is n, any number, right, then x will be plus or minus square root of n. I want to emphasize that there are two solutions generally. Two solutions. Okay? The only time there's not is when n is 0, and then there's going to be only one solution. But generally speaking, there'll be two solutions here, and this is called the square root formula. It's a very valuable formula, and let me show you why. Number one, we have the statement x squared is 9. Now, again, that is a quadratic. X squared is a number. That means x will be plus or minus the square root of that number 9. Now notice something about this 9 here. 9, or I should say, is a perfect square. So the square root of 9, this portion here, is really the value 3. So that now I'll say to you that x is plus or minus 3. I just solved for x. There are two solutions. In one case, x is positive 3. In the other case, x is negative 3. This is the solution set notation for the two solutions, and this is an illustration of what we're going to be using here. Number 3. X squared is negative 16. If x squared is negative 16, we know x will be, I'll emphasize, plus or minus the square root of negative 16. We're going to have to evaluate or simplify this radical. Now, the square root of negative 16 is negative 1 times 16. Square root of negative 1 times the square root of 16, I times 4. Final answer is that x will be plus or minus 4i. In solution set form, 4i minus 4i. And we are done. Number 5. X squared is 25. Then x will be plus or minus the square root of 25. The square root of 25 is 5. X is plus or minus 5. Set notation, positive 5, comma, negative 5. Number 7. X squared is negative 36. X will be plus or minus square root of negative 36. Let's emphasize the two answers, plus or minus, and then the square root of 36, or negative 36, becomes square root of negative 1 times 36. You guys did your homework on this, because I'm eventually going to not go through the detail. X will be plus or minus your 6i. Solution set, 6i minus 6i. Number 9, x squared minus 4 equals 0. First glance, we cannot use the square root formula here. But if we solve for x squared by adding 4 to both sides, we end up with x squared being positive 4. Now we could use the square root formula, and x becomes plus or minus the square root of positive 4. The square root of 4 is 2. So x will be plus or minus 2. Solution set form, positive 2, negative 2. Number 11. X squared minus 1 is 0. Add 1 to both sides. X squared is positive 1. The square root formula says x is plus or minus square root of 1. The square root of 1 is 1, so x will be plus or minus 1, positive 1, and negative 1. Number 13. X squared plus 4 is 0. Solve for x squared. Subtract your 4. X squared is a negative 4. Okay? Now we can use the square root principle. And we can say x will be plus or minus square root of a negative 4. Now, what I'm going to say to you is you did some homework on this. So I'm not going to go through every detail, but to say the square root of negative 4 is 2i. Okay, so you can review your homework on that. And your final answer is plus or minus 2i. So I have 2i and negative 2i. And you're done. Number 15. X squared plus 1 is 0. Solve for x squared. We get x squared is negative 1. Now, by the square root formula, x will be plus or minus the square root of negative 1. Now remember, the square root of negative 1 is defined to be I. We'll put that in red. That's the number I. So your final answer will be plus or minus I, negative I, in solution set form. Number 17, we have x squared minus 100 is 0. You're going to add 100 to both sides. You get x squared is 0 plus 100 is 100. So x will be plus or minus square root of 100. Now, square root of 100, if you recall, is 10. So your final answer is plus or minus 10. Solution set, positive 10, negative 10. Number 19. X squared is 8. Solving for x by the square root formula. X will be plus or minus the square root of 8. So now this radical here, the square root of 8, we can't evaluate because 8 is not a perfect square. So you're going to have to simplify this square root of 8. And from past homework, 4 times 2 is 8, square root of 4 times square root of 2, 2 square root of 2. X is plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2. 2 square root of 2, negative 2 square root of 2. And you're done. 21, we have x squared is 72. X will be plus or minus square root of 72. We have to simplify. Now, 36 times 2, 36, 6 square root of 6. X is plus or minus 6 times the square root of 2. That's our solution. But it's 6 square root of 2 and minus 6 square root of 2. And you're done. 23. X squared is 50. If x squared is 50, then x will be plus or minus square root of 50. Okay, and I'm going to emphasize again this plus or minus because there's two solutions. And generally speaking, there is two except when x squared is 0. Nevertheless, simplify the radical. Okay, square root of 50 we write as 25 times 2. Square root of 25, square root of 2. 5 times the square root of 2. X is plus or minus 5 times the square root of 2. 5 square root of 2 minus 5 square root of 2. And you're done. 25. X squared is negative 18. So, let's see what x is by the square root formula. X will be, here we go, plus or minus square root of negative 18. Square root of negative 18, we're going to write this as the square root of negative 1 times 9 times 2, square root of negative 1, square root of 9, square root of 2, I times 3 times the square root of 2. We simplify the radical of the square root of negative 18. This gives us x equals plus or minus 3 square root of 2 I. Writing this in complex number form where we put the I at the end. Make sure I is outside of your radical, and this is your solution. 3 square root of 2i and minus 3 square root of 2i. And you're done. Number 27. X squared is negative 80. X is plus or minus square root of that negative 80. I'm going to have to simplify this radical. Okay. Let's simplify this. Let's try to think about this, right? Square root of negative 80, if we write it as negative 1 times the largest perfect square that goes into 80. Well, 4, I think it's 16. Yes. 16 times 5. Okay, let's write this better. Negative 1 times 16 times 5. Square root of negative 1, square root of 16, I, 4, square root of 5. X will be plus or minus 4 square root of 5, I. 4 square root of 5i and minus 4 square root of 5i. And you're done. 29. X squared minus 24 is 0. We're going to have to solve for x squared if we're going to use the square root formula. So you're going to add 24 to both sides. You get x squared is 24, or x will be, now by the square root formula, the square root of your 24. So notice we're using that relationship. If x squared is a number, then x will be plus or minus the square root of that number. We just have to simplify the radical. And this is 4 times 6, the square root of 4, square root of 6. It is 2 times the square root of 6. X is plus or minus 2 times the square root of 6. So you got two answers. 2 times the square root of 6 and negative 2 times the square root of 6. 31. X squared minus 18 is 0. And add 18 to both sides. X squared is 18. X is plus or minus the square root of 18. We're going to have to simplify that radical. Square root of 18 can be written as 9 times 2, the square root of 9 times the square root of 2, or 3 times the square root of 2. Plus or minus 3 times the square root of 2. And you're done. (33) X squared plus 32 is 0. You subtract your 32 from both sides. Get x squared is minus 32. By the square root formula, x is plus or minus square root of negative 32. We have to simplify this radical. Negative 1 times 16 times our 2 gives us negative 32. You got the product rule. I times 4 times the square root of 2. So then x will be plus or minus 4 square root of 2 I. And you're done. 35. X squared plus 125 equals 0. We're going to subtract 125 from both sides. X squared is negative 125. Now, by the square root formula, we get x equals plus or minus square root of negative 125. The radical then is negative 1 times 25 times 5, or square root of negative 1 square root of 25 times the square root of 5. I times 5 times the square root of 5. X is plus or minus 5 times the square root of 5 I. 5 times the square root of 5i minus 5 times the square root of 5i. And you're done. Number 37, we have x squared is 5. Now by the square root formula, x will be plus or minus the square root of 5. Now, the question is, can I simplify the square root of 5? The answer is no. It's already simplified. So, The square root of 5 and minus the square root of 5 are my two solutions. 39. X squared is 2. By the square root formula, x is plus or minus the square root of 2. Notice that the square root of 2 is already simplified, so my two answers are the square root of 2 and minus square root of 2. 41. X squared is 12. X is plus or minus the square root of 12. The square root of 12 can be simplified, and that's 4 times 3, or 2 times the square root of 3. So x is plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3. Here's my solution. Set notation, 2 times the square root of 3 minus 2 times the square root of 3. (43) X squared is negative 3. X will be plus or minus the square root of negative 3. Now I can simplify this in the sense that I could write it as negative 1 times 3, square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3, I times the square root of 3, or the square root of 3i. So that x will be plus or minus the square root of 3, I. Square root of 3i minus square root of 3i. And you're done. 45. X squared is negative 10. So that x will be plus or minus the square root of negative 10. We're going to simplify this radical as negative 1 times 10, square root formula, or the square root principle, and I get the square root of 10 I. X is plus or minus the square root of 10 I. And we're done. 47. X squared plus 11 is 0. Now we can't use the square root formula unless we have an x squared by itself. So we're going to have to solve for x squared. So you subtract your 11. X squared becomes negative 11. Now, by the square root formula, if we use this now, x is plus or minus square root of negative 11. And so x will be plus or minus. We have to simplify this radical. Negative 1 times 11, square root of negative 1, square root of 11, I times the square root of 11, square root of 11i. And we're done. (49) X squared plus 15 is 0. We can't use the square root formula. We're going to have to subtract 15 from both sides. X squared is negative 15, and x is going to be plus or minus square root of negative 15. Well, this radical is going to be negative 1 times 15, square root of negative 1, square root of 15, I times the square root of 15. And we write this as the square root of 15i. So x will be plus or minus the square root of 15 I, and you're done. X squared plus 2 is 0. Subtract your 2 from both sides. X squared is negative 2. X will be plus or minus square root of negative 2. Square root of negative 2 is the square root of negative 1 times 2. Square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2, I times the square root of 2. And we write this as the square root of 2i. So, x is plus or minus the square root of 2i. Here's our solving part. Square root of 2i minus square root of 2i. Here's the solution set. (53). We get 4x squared minus 20 is 0. Now we have to solve for x squared because we can't use the square root formula the way this is written. Solve for x squared. So we're going to get this x squared here by itself. And we do that by adding 20 to both sides. 4x squared equals 20. Divide 4 to both sides. X squared is 5. Square root formula says x is plus or minus the square root of 5. We can't simplify the radical, so we are done. This is our set notation. (5x squared minus 30 is 10. Again, like the prior problem, we have to solve for x squared. Add 30 to both sides. We get 5x squared equals 40. Divide both sides by 5. And I get x squared equals 8. Now, x will be plus or minus the square root of 8 by the square root formula. So by now, we're getting a little more efficient with what we're doing. And just to let you guys know, the square root of 8 then, we've seen in prior problems to be 2 times the square root of 2. So you can look at any of your notes or any examples on these videos, and you will discover that the square root of 8 is always 2 times the square root of 2. And this is your set notation, so we're done with 55. (57) 2x squared plus our 30 is 20. And like the prior examples, we have to solve for x squared. We have to get x squared by itself. So, solve for x squared. Subtract 30 from both sides. I get 2x squared equals 20 minus 30 is negative 10. Divide both sides by 2. I get x squared is negative 5. X will be plus or minus the square root of negative 5. And so at this point now, I just want to point out to you again that this radical is really the square root of 5i. Okay, so that means x is plus or minus the square root of 5i. Two solutions. (59) 6x squared minus 30 is negative 12. We're going to have to solve for x squared. We're going to get x squared by itself. And how you do that is to add 30 to both sides. 6x squared is 18. We're going to now divide both sides by 6, so I have cancellation on the left here, and that gives us x squared equals 3, because 18 divided by 6 is 3. X will be plus or minus the square root of 3. Two solutions, square root of 3 minus square root of 3, and you're done. '61. We have x minus 2 squared equals a 4. Now, here's what I'm going to say to you. In lecture, I give the square root principle like this. If x squared equals n, and I'll write it this way, then, or I should say, if triangle squared is n, then my triangle will be plus or minus the square root of n. And the reason I give it this way is because we have here something in our triangle. So what this says for us now will be, if you notice here, I have an x minus 2 in that triangle. So by this square root principle, I can say my triangle is plus or minus the square root of 4. Notice though, what's in the triangle? In that triangle again is the x minus 2 term. So in other words, to get rid of the parentheses and the power of 2, to make this go away, this power of 2 essentially go away, I can have it go away by the square root formula, but the price you pay is to do two things. You take plus or minus, and you take the square root of that number. And that's the repeating theme here for the square root formula. But now, what's between your parentheses and that perfect square, it can be an expression like x plus 2, x minus 2, x plus 8, 2x plus 4, whatever. You now get x minus 2 is plus or minus the square root of 4 is the value 2. So here's what I want people to consider. We're still solving for x, and you're going to have to add 2 to both sides. So what you end up getting here is that x will be 2 plus or minus 2. We're going to have to discuss now what this means to have x being 2 plus or minus 2. So here's what this means. It means two cases. In one case, x is 2 plus 2. In the other case, x is 2 minus 2. And 2 plus 2 is 4. And then 2 minus 2 is 0. So your solutions are 4, 0. And notice this again. Here's what it really means. Plus, plus. Minus, and minus. In one case you add, and in the other case you subtract. And that's the meaning of plus or minus. So you have two solutions here. X is 4 and x is 0. So go back. This is what you're going to see now in general. So all the other questions we did were designed to warm us up to some little bit more complicated problems. Let's use this principle. And notice we have number 63. Let's see how 63 goes. We have x minus 5 in parentheses squared is positive 16. So notice in my triangle now again, I have this x minus 5. So, by the square root principle, that x minus 5 will be plus or minus the square root of 16. Okay, we're going to emphasize that. That's what's in the triangle. Now notice, x minus 5 then becomes plus or minus 4 because the square root of 16 is 4. This number is 4. We're solving for x. Add 5 to both sides, and on the left, you get x equals 5 plus or minus 4. Two situations. X is 5 plus 4, or x is 5 minus 4. Again, plus, plus, minus, and minus. In one case you add, in the other case you subtract. So the solutions here are going to be 9, 1. That's number 63. $65. X plus 1 squared is 25. Notice again, x plus 1 is in my parentheses, and it's being raised to the second power. So that means I have x plus 1 is plus or minus the square root of 25. X plus 1 will be plus or minus 5 because the square root of 25 is 5. Okay? Let's focus on this. This number is 5. Now, subtract 1 from both sides. You end up getting x is negative 1 plus or minus 5. And again, that means two things. X is negative 1 plus 5, or x is negative 1 minus 5. In one case, we add, and in the other case, we subtract. Positive 4, negative 6. And we're done. X plus 3 squared is 81. Notice, go to x plus 3 under this radical. I'm sorry, no radical. X plus 3 is a parentheses to the second power. Plus or minus the square root of 81. Okay. We use the square root formula here. Now, notice again, square root of 81 is 9. So, we have x plus 3 is plus or minus 9. Let's subtract 3 from both sides. X is negative 3 plus or minus 9. Two answers. X is negative 3 plus 9, and x is negative 3 minus 9. X is positive 6, and x is negative 12. Two solutions, positive 6, negative 12. Here's your answers. X plus 2 squared is negative 4. Okay. Again, notice x plus 2 is in parentheses to the second power. So this will give me x plus 2 being plus or minus the square root of negative 4. Remember that, x plus 2 by the square root formula. The square root of negative 4 is 2i. So we get x plus 2 is plus or minus my 2i. Subtract 2 from both sides, and you get x is negative 2 plus or minus 2i. And again, let me point out to you that we can't combine these terms. So in solution set, we get negative 2 plus 2i, negative 2 minus 2i, and you're done. $71. X plus 1 squared is negative 25. X plus 1 plus or minus square root of negative 25, because again, your x plus 1 is in parentheses to the second power. We simply applied the square root formula. The square root of negative 25 is 5i. So I get x plus 1 is plus or minus 5i. That means, not yet, does it mean, to solve for x, we subtract 1 from both sides. We'll get x is negative 1 plus or minus 5i. Now that means two things. Negative 1 plus 5i and negative 1 minus 5i is my solution set for number 71. 73. 2 x plus 5 squared is 36. We're going to need to solve for, let's do this. We need to solve for x plus 5 squared, this whole thing, so that I can use the square root formula. So I guess we're going to have to now divide both sides by our 2, so our 2 goes away. And then notice what we have. We'll have x plus 5 squared is R18. Could use the square root formula. X plus 5. Hold on here. Okay. This is going to give us x plus 5 is plus or minus the square root of 18, where the square root of 18 can be simplified as 3 square root of 2. So don't forget that. X plus 5 is plus or minus 3 square root of 2. Now we get to do the following. We get to subtract 5 from both sides because we're solving for x. Now x is negative 5 plus or minus 3 square root of 2. And this again means two things. It means negative 5 plus 3 times the square root of 2. Negative 5 minus 3 times the square root of 2. And that's number 73. 75 is 3 times x1 squared equals 24. Again, we are going to try to solve for the x squared minus 1 to the second power by dividing here both sides by our 3. 3's go away. We have x minus 1 squared. 24 divided by 3 is 8. X minus 1 will be plus or minus square root of 8 by the square root formula. And again, let's recall, the square root of 8 is 2 times the square root of 2. So x plus 1 becomes plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2. We're going to add 1 to both sides to solve for x. Okay, x is 1 plus or minus 2 square root of 2. 1 plus 2 square root of 2, and 1 minus 2 square root of 2. We solve number 75. (77) 4 x minus 1 squared is negative 16. Again, we're going to solve for x minus 1 squared by dividing both sides by 4. What you end up getting is x minus 1 squared is negative 4. By the square root formula, x minus 1 plus or minus square root of negative 4i. Oh, sorry. Let's go back. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back. Getting way ahead. Okay. It's been a long exercise. Negative 16 divided by positive 4 is negative 4. Well, getting tired. Okay. X minus 1 squared is negative 4. All right. Now by the square root formula, x minus 1 is plus or minus square root of negative 4. Something was very wrong there. The square root of negative 4 is 2i. So I can replace my radical with a 2i. I get x minus 1 plus or minus 2i. Solving for x, we got to add 1 to both sides. And now we get x equal to 1 plus or minus my 2i. Two solutions, 1 plus 2i and 1 minus 2i for 77. (79) we have 3 times x minus 2 to the third power, and that'll give us a negative 27. So here we go. We're going to have to solve for x minus 2 to the second power, and we're going to do that by dividing both sides by 3. I get cancellation here. And so now I have x minus 2 squared is actually negative 9. By the square root formula, x minus 2 is plus or minus square root of negative 9. Replace the square root of negative 9 with 3i. And if you do, we get x minus 2 is plus or minus your 3i. And add 2 to both sides. X is 2 plus or minus 3i. Two answers, 2 plus 3i, 2 minus 3i. And that's number 79. (81) 2 x plus 1 squared is negative 40. We're going to solve for x plus 1 squared. And in order to do that, divide both sides by positive 2, and you end up getting x plus 1 squared being negative 20. By the square root formula, x plus 1 is plus or minus square root of negative 20. Simplify the radical. Square root of negative 20 becomes 4 square root of 5 I. Excuse me, that's not 4. That is actually 2 square root of 5i. There we go. Check your homework. Simplify your radical. X plus 1 will be plus or minus 2 square root of 5i. And we'll subtract 1 from both sides to solve for x. We get x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2 square root of 5i. And in solution set form, we have -1 plus 2 square root of 5i, -1 minus 2 square root of 5i. And you're done.